So good evening, everyone. This video will be being recorded and published the day after the stream because of technical issues. So apologies for anyone that was really looking forward to our talk about archaeology yesterday. But I've already revealed what we'll be talking about today. We're talking about archaeology. For those of you who don't know what the project Embassy Talks is all about, Embassy Talks is a project organized by the Embassy of the Czech Republic and the Embassy of the Slovak Republic in Canberra. And we talk about a wide range of topics, all the way from economics, trade, small business, innovation, all the way through cultural, like bilingual education, film festivals, art, and even we have been known to take on historical topics such as the Battle of Tobruk, even the Holocaust. Today we'll be diving a lot further into the past to prehistoric times. We'll be talking about various excavations that have taken part in Central Europe, in what is now the Czech Republic. And our guests will be, well, I'm sure they're all planning and hoping to roll up their sleeves and get involved in a dig that will be taking place in Slovakia once the COVID situation allows. But we'll be hearing more about that from our guests today, who are all archaeologists and researchers at the Australian National University in Canberra. And so I guess we can now get into introducing our guests today. So today with us, we've got Ladislav Nejman, a researcher at Australian National University.
Hello.
And next to him, Duncan Wright, a senior lecturer, and if I'm not mistaken, the head of the archaeological faculty.
It feels like a factory sometimes, yeah.
And then last but not least, we've got Nick Skopal as well.
Hello.
When I was talking with Nick over the phone this morning, I think it'd be, if we go off the analogy of a factory, he considers himself one of the frontline workers on that factory, and obviously has a lot of very, very interesting experience that we'll hear about. So we won't just be talking about those excavations I mentioned that's part of the project Human Origins in Central Europe, but about all the projects that our guests have been working on, are working on currently, and look forward to working on in the future. So I guess I'd start, maybe if you guys could all introduce yourselves quickly. I think we'll start with Lad. If I could say just one last thing before I hand over to you. For me, my idea of an archaeologist was very much informed by a show that I used to watch. I think it was a show that came out in the 90s. I lived in the UK for a few years, and so it was quite popular over there. And it was called Time Team. Have you heard of it? Have you seen this show?
Yes.
Everyone's seen it? Is that what it's really like?
No, it's actually more like Indiana Jones, to be honest. But
that seems cooler. I don't know what's better. I mean, there's the Phil from Time Team reminds me of Indiana Jones anyway, so it's, I guess.
I think that the Time Team is really good in sort of presenting archaeology to the public, but it tends to sort of present the, because it's so sort of compacted, just like any other program is. So it kind of presents the highlights and the sort of exciting bits, I guess. Whereas, in real archaeology, there's sort of lots of not as exciting sort of work in between.
And so what do you do at ANU, and what have you been working on lately, Lad? We stick with you for introduction.
So I'm sort of broadly working in two areas at the moment. So one is I do research with my team at archaeological sites, so mainly caves in Czech Republic and hopefully Slovakia from next year. But I'm also involved in another project in Australia where I'm studying the expansion of Parmanuan languages, so the indigenous languages. So two areas in very different parts of the world.
And do you have a preference do you have a passion more for archaeology or for the anthropological side of things that you just described? Do you like the finds and the diggings and the discovering objects, or is the tracing of languages as well something that's just as interesting for you?
So with the Australian project, with studying the expansion of Parmanuan languages, my role in that project is actually archaeological. So I'm studying this special kind of Australian stone tool. It's called, the archaeologists call it a backed artifact. And so that type of stone tool, it looks like it spread with alongside the spread of a new language across Australia. So I'm sort of involved with the archaeology part of that project.
Oh, so the assumption is wherever that tool appears is potentially there could be some link with the group that was originally speaking that language.
Yeah, so there's a strong link. So this project, it's funded by the Australian Research Council. It's a big project with quite a few different investigators, archaeologists, and linguists. And it's looking at the link between the spread of the backed artifacts, that stone tool technology, and the spread of Parma-Nyuan languages. And at the moment, it looks like that there is a strong link, which is very interesting. Yep.
Cool. Duncan, moving on to you. How did you end up at ANU, and what are you working on at the moment?
So I guess I ended up at ANU in the long term because rather than being excited about Time Team so much, I was excited about Indiana Jones. I shouldn't admit this really on camera, but there we go. As a kid, I used to sort of collect old stuff, and I got very excited about old stories. And so it was just a natural trajectory to become an archaeologist. I ended up at ANU in the shorter term because I did my master's here, and then I did a PhD at Monash University, and finished up again here when I was very lucky to get a lectureship, and yes, I'm now senior lecturer, which is great fun.
And so Lad's got his, and I've already forgotten, and I don't think I'd even managed to pronounce the name of the language or the cultural group that you mentioned. What was it?
Yeah, it's the Parma-Nyuan language.
So Lad's got his Parma-Nyuan languages that he's working on right now. What are you working on at the moment, Duncan?
All right. Well, so I'm also working on a few projects at the moment. I think I would probably call myself an anthropological archaeologist for the most part. So I tend to work with communities who are interested in developing cultural tourism, or it may be to do with native title or these kind of things. And so they want to get a cultural heritage audit done. And find out a bit more about the deep history of particular sites or particular ancestors. And so at the moment, we've got a very exciting project that's been going on for 7 years, I guess. And that is, it's following this ancestor who originally comes down from southern Papua New Guinea. And he brings all of these new ceremonies and new techniques about treatment of the unburied dead. It's effectively a mortuary cult. It's also been called a headhunting cult. This is because at each of these places that Wyatt went, or many of the places, initiation ceremonies started to happen. And this presented the information that Wyatt was bringing the communities. So this is in Western Torres Strait, but also Central and Eastern Torres Strait. And yeah, so there was all of these pretty intense activities that were going on, coming of age rituals. And so we've been excavating sites along this trackway, also pulling together information about from museums and archives around the world, that really bring together the objects and the stories about this particular culture hero. So that's one of the projects. There are other projects on mainland Australia, but maybe we'll leave them for now, although we've actually all just come back from one, so maybe I should say something about it.
Go for it.
So this is we're just starting, it's sort of a consultation stage. Work with the Inningai community near Barcaldine in central Queensland. And we've been, again, a community archaeology project. The community are really interested for cultural tourism reasons to get an idea about the archaeological history, but also they've brought a number of senior lawmen down from Alice Springs and elsewhere to get an idea of the cultural landscape according to these perspectives as well. And so we had an incredible time, really, and probably Nick can mention this as well, sat around the campfire with these guys and providing very different perspectives on the past. And so we had one incredible moment where a senior lawman was drawing in the soil the story of the Seven Sisters, and basically all of these circles that were these sand drawings. And he was explaining how this Turrborough estate fit within this story that connected communities across the country. And then it basically formed itself into what was effectively a gigantic rock art picture or art picture. So you think of central Queensland art, Aboriginal art. This is what we were seeing in front of us on the ground. So truly remarkable experience. And we get that, I guess, all of the time with this anthropological archaeology. But thanks to LAD, I've also had this amazing experience of working in Czech Republic. So I think for the best part of, 12 years or something like that, we've been excavating amazing sites looking at that mid to upper Paleolithic transition. So the time when there were both Neanderthals and modern humans that were moving into this area.
And Nick, do you have anything you want to add to that, or just a quick introduction for yourself?
Quick introduction. So I'm a PhD student at ANU. And I actually work in Laos and Assam in India. So I don't know if you've recently heard in Laos, there's the Plain of Jars, and they just got World Heritage listing. So I work there, and specifically I do a lot of field work, trekking through the mountains and the jungle, finding new jar sites. So these jars are these huge stone jars that have been carved out, and at some sites we found burials around them, and then there's some evidence of mortuary remains placed inside, and they're about 3,000 years old. But we also have similar ones in Assam in India, which is what's quite fascinating, because when you actually look at a map, between those two areas is just Myanmar or Burma. So there could be this large sort of culture moving all the way down. Anyway, that's what I work in, but I'm very privileged to be able to work with Lad and Duncan in the Czech Republic and soon Slovakia, which I'm very much looking forward to.
And I maybe stick with you for a second, Nick. Maybe do you understand much about the process of how it became World Heritage listed? Because I guess what interests me is when does someone decide that a site needs to be protected, and when is it just an archaeological site that then becomes open access walking track to the public in the forest, for example?
Yeah, sure. Look, I don't know heaps about it, but effectively what happens, and Duncan actually might be able to talk more to this. UNESCO, they went in originally, and they did a whole lot of survey work and mapping and some test excavations, so they can really understand the sites. And from that work, there's a lot of workshops and working with the government that they work towards to get this World Heritage listing in a really sort of short way. But I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Duncan, or.
It's a really complex one, because obviously all sites are significant, and so making that call about what is of World Heritage significance is a really, really tricky one. I haven't been involved in anything quite like that, but my understanding is it needs to be it needs to represent a particular element of heritage that hasn't been represented in any other way. And the Plain of Jars is just this remarkable site that is of huge cultural heritage significance. And I guess you may need to interview Dougal O'Reilly, who is Nick's supervisor and has done a whole bunch of work, and maybe ask him that question.
I guess the thing that interests me is that, as far as I'm aware, this might be a question for Lad, but the sites in the Czech Republic are open to the public at the moment. And there was one of them, I think Švédův Stůl, that was quite a popular destination for walkers and hikers. And that's a site that people have been coming back to for repeatedly for quite a time. So what interests me is from what I understood, the last excavation focused a lot on the pile of waste that was out the front of it. What I find fascinating is, do the tourists and walkers that come to that site have an impact on those layers? So when you're coming to return to the site later, do you have to kind of filter through the impact that people have had on the site in the years since the last study was done?
They have an impact in the sense of like every time it rains. So there's this gigantic discard pile. So discard pile is all this sediment that was excavated inside the cave a long time ago, and it's been brought outside the cave and dumped outside the cave. And when it rains, or just with sort of general erosion, there are still many sort of archaeological finds in that discard pile. And if they're on the surface and someone notices them, they get picked up, like people souvenir them, and that's a problem. So, for example, in 1964, there was a Neanderthal tooth found on that discard pile. But maybe Duncan can say a bit more about this, because he's sort of he focused on the discard pile.
Maybe it would be good. I realized probably before that to just maybe say a little bit in general about the site, the Švédův Stůl.
This site Švédův Stůl, it's a cave in the Moravian Karst, not far from the city of Brno, and it's been excavated sort of in several times in the late 19th century, because European archaeology sort of started in the 19th century, but at that time the techniques of excavation and sort of general knowledge was very undeveloped compared to now. So unfortunately, in that late 19th century and also early 20th century, when that cave was excavated, it was excavated sort of using, by today's standards, quite crude methods, which meant that many things were missed. So they were dumped outside the cave on that discard pile, which we actually a section of it we studied in great detail in 2019 when we did our first excavation at that cave. But as regarding sort of the finds that were, so in 1905, somebody discovered a Neanderthal skull, or part of a Neanderthal skull, Neanderthal jaw, inside the cave. So ever since then, it's been sort of a well-known site, because we know that Neanderthals lived there, or they certainly lived in the area. We know they spent some time there because some of their stone tools were found there. With regards to how their bones got there, we're not sure whether they got buried in the cave or whether hyenas, because at that time hyenas were very common in Europe, so they may have dragged sort of carcasses, human animal carcasses, into the cave, and then that's how the bones could have ended up in the cave. So we're not sure whether the Neanderthal body was buried there or how it got there, but it was certainly found there.
Duncan, did you have anything to add, or any expertise regarding the waste pile at the front, what you learnt from it?
Maybe we can return to that should we have time. I don't think it's going to fascinate the listeners all that much.
So what did you find the most interesting about the Švédův Stůl?
Okay, well, am I allowed to talk about these discoveries? Because they're not allowed. What would you say? Some of the things that haven't been published yet?
I think in a general way we can discuss them, yeah.
We can go very generally, and then we can move on to the Hradem cave, where you can be more specific.
Okay, all right. Well, the things that I found very exciting, I've always been interested in things like portable art and well, just art in general. And so in the backfill pile, there were really fascinating things. So basically worked teeth, and there was a fragment of stone in which there were engravings on that, these cross-hatched engravings. And so to me, this is really incredible, because it gives you insight into the human mind. 30,000 years ago, or whatever it might be, 40,000 years. And so, yeah, that I found very exciting.
And Nick, did you get a chance to go to the cave, the Švédův Stůl?
Yeah, so yes. So I think one of the fascinating parts was I always like there was woolly mammoths or the woolly rhinos, where you find the teeth and things like that. I just sort of imagining those animals back then. It's absolutely fascinating. That's what always sort of puts you back, that there was these huge animals that we do not see anymore. Wandering around, and when the Neanderthals were there, and modern anatomical humans. So I think that's what always excited me about it.
Actually, maybe a question for you. I read an article, a Czech article about the cave, and they were mentioning that a lot of people, not only was it a popular destination for trampers, like people wandering around the Czech Republic to sleep, spend the night, but apparently it's known for people getting chills down their spine, like a strange energy when they enter the cave. Did you feel anything like that? Or is it?
Oh, look, it is a bit spooky down then, especially, when the sun's going down and everyone sort of wandered off because they're taking all the things away, and, you've been left up there for some reason, and you're like, it is a bit spooky. So I know Duncan and Lad will just laugh at me, but I could see that.
It's just the weight of history as well. You kind of feel it.
Indeed.
It doesn't necessarily need to be haunted or anything. Does anyone else want to add something on Švédův Stůl before we move to Pod Hradem? So I'm excited to show our viewers some photos of that cave. No?
Okay.
Perfect. Lad, maybe while I show the photos, did you want to kind of explain why you decided to excavate at Pod Hradem, and what's the significance of the site?
Mm-hmm. So the main reason why I wanted to excavate Pod Hradem Cave, so Pod Hradem Cave is also in the Moravian Karst, not far from the city of Brno. There was a previous excavation there in the 1950s, which removed a lot of the sediment, but because it's a large cave, there was still a lot of sediment to excavate when I started in 2011. And so for me, the main attraction was because it had geological and cultural layers from a period that we call Middle Upper Paleolithic transition. So Paleolithic basically means Stone Age. So Middle Stone Age was when Neanderthals lived in Europe, and then Upper Paleolithic was when modern humans started moving to Europe from Africa via the Middle East. And so that period occurred roughly between 40 to 50,000 years ago. So if you can so in Europe, there was the indigenous people for several 100,000 years were the Neanderthals. So they actually evolved in Europe from another species, and they were the only species of humans that we know so far in Europe for several 100,000 years. And then suddenly, approximately, sometime between 45 to 50,000 years ago, the very first waves of modern humans, so that's modern humans is Homo sapiens, so that's basically our species. So we evolved in Africa, and then we moved to Middle East, and then from Middle East we started sort of expanding into Europe. And so for a while there was two different species of humans living in Europe, so including in Czech Republic. And so in Pod Hradem Cave, the big attraction there is that we have sedimentary layers from this period. So by excavating these layers, we could find a few clues about what was happening during that time. There's sort of a very vigorous debate about the Middle Upper Paleolithic transition, or about when Neanderthals, or when modern humans met the Neanderthals, and what did that look like? Did they fight, or did they get on? How long did they sort of coexist in the same places? There's just so many different questions. Also, there was always a question, did they interbreed? Because Neanderthals have different DNA, so we're separated by I think the latest estimate is about approximately maybe 400,000 or 500,000 years of genetic isolation between Neanderthals and modern humans. But today we of course know through many genetic studies that that Neanderthals and modern humans did interbreed, and all people living today who have an ethnic origin outside of Africa have Neanderthal genes. So we know they interbred. But what we wanted to know at Bod Hradem Cave is maybe sort of find a few. So all of the Middle Upper Paleolithic transition, or any part of prehistory, really, it's like a giant puzzle with many of the pieces missing. And so the really exciting part of being an archaeologist is maybe just finding one or two more pieces to fit into the puzzle. And for me personally, that's the most exciting part. So we were hoping to find, maybe some stone artifacts, or sort of any kind of information that might tell us what life was like back then during that Middle Upper Paleolithic transition. And I think we did find a few pieces into that huge puzzle that still has a lot of pieces missing.
Awesome. I think one of the specific objects that you discovered that our viewers just saw a second ago was, I don't know how else to describe it other than they look like wooden sticks with carvings in it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like little notches.
Yes, yeah. So that was a bone bead.
Oh, bone.
So it's a tiny bone bead. So we think it's probably the oldest piece of jewelry that we know of in Central Europe, or certainly in Czech Republic. So it was a very tiny bone bead, sort of a hollow bone from a small animal, and it had 3 sets of incisions. So altogether, I think there were 17 incisions, but this object was only 8 millimeters long and 2 millimeters wide, and we only found one of them in the entire site. But it turns out that same object, there's been several that have been found in southwestern Europe, so in France and Spain, and then there's several that have been found in Russia, but they all date to the same time period, which is we call it early Aurignacian period. It's one of the first waves of modern humans into Europe. And so over that sort of vast expanse of territory, from southwestern Europe all the way to Russia, this culture had these common elements. And it only existed for approximately, as far as we can tell, about 3,000 or 4,000 years. And so from excavating Bod Hradem Cave, by finding this object, we were able to conclude that these people at that time, so approximately 40,000 years ago, that they visited the cave, or at least once. And so the really interesting thing here is that that particular type of bone bead, it's never been found in Central Europe. It's only been found in southwestern Europe and then in Russia, but nothing really in between as far as I'm aware. So we were able to sort of, put one piece in the puzzle, because we're able to conclude that, this culture sort of with these bone beads, it ranged across that whole territory. So I think that's the object that you're referring to.
It definitely sounds like. How much can you actually tell about how people lived? I mean, that's a very long time ago. Can you look at the soil and work out what the climate was like? How much can you actually tell about how that culture that lived in a very specific time, very long time ago, how they lived?
Yeah, so with modern day techniques, we can sort of tell more and more. So, for example, even 20 years ago was, like today, there's more techniques than we had 20 years ago. So one way is we did quite a few different analyses, and we published a number of sort of scientific articles about our findings in sort of different international journals. But one thing we looked at is it's a fairly new method. It's called sediment ancient DNA. So a recent finding is that that DNA of sort of ancient animals and humans that lived in the area, it actually it binds itself to the soil, like to the sediment particles, and it can survive for tens of thousands of years. So even in cases where there's no bones left or just nothing else left of those people or animals, if we analyze that sediment for DNA, we can actually extract the DNA from the sediment and find out which animals or even people were living at that site at the time. So that was one. There was many other things that we did, but this was one of them. This is a fairly recent one that was discovered fairly recently.
In terms of animals that are at the site, maybe a question for Nick, given you were so excited about imagining all the woolly rhinos and everything running around. Was there evidence of any animals at the Hradem cave?
Unfortunately, I actually wasn't at this excavation,
no.
so I'll pass it off to Duncan.
You can just happily imagine then.
I know. Look, it's fascinating.
So, Nick, you'll be very pleased that we had those really interesting animals as well. We had woolly rhinoceros, we had reindeer, we had, and there was smaller animals as well. So all those sort of animals. So I don't have the list in front of me, but sort of all those large, exciting animals as well as smaller animals, we found their DNA in. I should say we didn't do the analysis itself. Many of these analyses, they're highly specialized. Sometimes there's only sort of a few labs in the world that do this analysis. So we didn't do the analysis ourselves, but we provided the samples for a laboratory in Germany who did the analysis.
Lad, did you want to maybe mention something about those small animals and how they provide information about climate change over that time?
Okay, so one so with the larger animals like rhinoceros, mammoth, reindeer, and various other animals, that they're often adapted to different types of climates. So they often live in colder climates, warmer climates. But one particular sort of group of animals which are very sensitive to climate are small. We call them microfauna. So they're basically just sort of little mice and sort of different types of mice and rodents. And different species of mice and rodents are fairly sensitive to climate change and to different types of climate. And so by studying the microfauna, we were able to, it sort of added to that whole knowledge base about the changing climate sort of around the cave over all those thousands of years.
And I think it's fair to say that there was a really nice matchup between different evidence. So you would have evidence for these periods of effectively ice ages, and then there wasn't cultural evidence. So we weren't getting stone artifacts or so many from that period. And so you're getting a really nice, getting good insight about how people are moving through this area. And in the really cold times, they're not occupying this cave or visiting this cave, but that changes later on. And I think that another thing that is fascinating about the Hradem excavation was, the stone artifacts. There weren't a huge number of them, but each of them told these really, really interesting stories. And I mean, one of those stories was looking at this transition from, so Lad was talking about this mid to upper Paleolithic transition, and that was very evident in the stone artifacts, that in the very, very early phase, we see that people, so the Neanderthal, we assume Neanderthals that were using this cave, they weren't traveling very far away from it. So all of the stone artifacts were local as far as we can see. But that changes massively when anatomically modern humans come along. Then we have stone artifacts coming from all over the place, so hundreds of kilometers to the north and the south and the west. And so we're really getting insight into these very mobile communities that are probably following animals and using these places as hunting camps. And so you can very much imagine that individual who was wearing the necklace or the bead that Lad was talking about, he may well have been coming from hundreds of kilometers away.
And if I ask where all these objects end up, what the process is, I guess as someone who doesn't know much about the process of archaeology, it would interest me. Obviously, some of the samples get sent off to various labs around the world, depending on their specialities. But what in general happens to all these objects?
So with the cultural finds, like with the stone artifacts, or for example that piece of jewelry, the bone bead. So once the study, so we usually have them until, so we can do sort of all these different analyses. So we have them in our possession until we finish all our analyses. But once the analyses are finished, they usually go to the local museum. Yeah, so that's what happens to all the sort of cultural objects or artifacts. They go to the local museums.
And
so they're all in Czech Republic now.
And Nick, maybe seeing as you have to go soon, maybe you could tell us a little bit about being someone that has experience from the excavation at Švédův Stůl from various places around Asia. Do you notice a difference between what it's like to be at an excavation or on site and work in the different environments, climates around the world?
Well, it's always more fun in the Czech Republic. The beer is better. So, but actually with the excavation itself, this Paleolithic archaeology it's fine grain. Like you have to be so careful. Not that you're not careful in other countries, but it's, you know, you're working over 10, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years when you're excavating. That it's a very slow and gentle process, because you need to capture every piece of information that you can. Whereas sometimes dealing in other countries where, you know, you might not be dealing with such as an old site or something, so, you know, it might be shallower, or, you know, in a few hundred years, you can sometimes be, you know, not that you're not careful, but excavate at sometimes a faster pace, because you know there's nothing there, like you're not looking out for certain things. But that to me is one of the big differences.
And in general, how long is a? Oh, sorry, Duncan.
No, I was just going to say, Nick, aren't there fewer mines in Czech Republic than your experience?
Yeah, that's one of the issues I do when you excavate in Laos. One of the problems is UXOs. You have unexploded ordnance from the Secret War, and it was actually the most heavily bombed country in the world. So this is one of the issues we have. So when I go trekking around finding sites, you've got to be really careful you don't stand on these cluster bombs.
Oh, yeah.
Because they're sort of scattered around the environment. I know. I'm young, silly man. That's the problem. But
what scares me is you almost sound used to it.
Well, you pretty much do just get used to it. You're like, you just got to be really careful where you stand. But when you're excavating, usually there'll be teams out there that will try and clear it. So there's these clearance teams that will clear for you before you excavate. But sometimes working with them, they might not pick up anything. So there are instances where you're excavating and you actually come across cluster bombs. So suddenly everyone is straight out of the excavation pit, and you have to like bring in the people to come and clear it properly. So yes, there is a difference there too.
If you could, what would interest me is, I understand that you don't just randomly dig anywhere, but there's some kind of surveying and geophysics going on in advance. Has it ever happened? Because in my head, when I'm imagining the field of jars that you're describing, I'm picturing that a geophysics image could possibly look exactly the same as a minefield, with all these objects scattered next to each other. Can you tell the difference?
You wouldn't pick it up. You wouldn't be able to probably tell the difference. You just be really, really careful.
So it was a leap of faith, I guess, with the.
Indeed. Well, that's what, you know, the passion of archaeology, you know, push the boundaries. Does
anyone have a story that tops that from their experiences on excavations?
No.
Yeah, I've got one.
I think
is it to do with the headhunters? I hope so.
No, it's not. This was in Palau in Micronesia, and I was working with Jeff Clark, who's a Pacific archaeologist, and also a number of the local Palauans, and we were excavating a site on Angao Island. I think it's the southernmost island there. And I was out and I was sieving. And so Jeff was inside and he was excavating this site. And we're trying to find the earliest evidence for people in that area. And then I'm sieving away and I look down and there's a hand grenade rattling around in the sieve. And so it would have been bad enough if that had happened without people knowing about it. But apparently the Angao guy, so he had, just for a laugh, he'd found this in the excavation inside and put it in the bucket. So I would find it and rattle it around in the sieve. And so, yeah, that was my experience of unexploded ordnance.
Oh, but still with the potential to explode, or this?
Yeah, particularly.
Obviously, it didn't explode, Duncan.
Yeah. Luckily, it didn't explode. But yeah, those Japanese hand grenades are notorious for going off. But let's face it, there are so many archaeology stories that we probably keep a bit quiet about because they involve sharks or all kinds of things, and you kind of don't want the OH&S people to hear too much about it. So maybe we should leave these stories from another time.
Well, not to make the people taking care of OH&S angry, but there's potentially some inspiration there for when you head to Slovakia. Don't know. You could combine the two stories and put landmines in sieves, or who knows? We could get up to maybe Nick. Just quickly before you go, when were you originally planning, or if Lad, if you want to answer, when were you originally planning to go to Dereva Skala in Slovakia and excavate there?
So we originally planned it for 2019, then 2020, then this year. In 2019, we didn't have all the permits, but in 2020 we did. But of course, we haven't been able to go there because of COVID. But sorry, that was a question for you, Nick.
I guess Nick, if you're looking forward to it.
Yeah, look, it'll be great. I think we're definitely I'm trying to push Duncan and Lad, but next year, if everything hopefully goes to plan, sort of that September time next year, that looks like hopefully everything will be open up and we can head over and and have a good long season there.
What?
And hopefully many future ones as well.
So you mentioned season. Is it a seasonal job, the excavations? Does it have to be done when it's not raining a lot, or does it matter at all?
Yes, it does definitely matter. So it would be it'd be awfully cold to excavate in winter in Slovakia. But also the ground would freeze, part of the ground would freeze and actually become quite difficult to excavate. So you generally want to try and stick to the drier months. You don't want to be excavating. So say even in Southeast Asia, people won't generally excavate during the wet season, because if you just have this constant barrage of rain, it's very, very hard to excavate. And you have similar issues in Central Europe.
So I guess you can set it up that like a lot of people set up with their holidays, where they return to Europe for the European summer and then come back to Australia and completely skip winter.
That's it.
I guess
exactly.
I still have the image of Time Team. It always seemed to be raining when they were excavating. So it just interested me as if it mattered or not.
I think that's just England.
Probably, yeah. Anyway, Nick, you have to go. So thanks for is there anything you want to say at the end?
No, that's it. Thank you very much for your time, though. So thank you.
Thanks, Nick. All the best in the future. I hope you get over to Slovakia next year. Fingers crossed.
Cheers. Thank you. Yes, fingers crossed. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So, Lad, do you want to tell us maybe a bit more about Dereva Skala that I mentioned? Why it's significant? Why are you planning to go and excavate there?
Yeah, so we've been excited for a long time about Dereva Skala. So there's just like sort of most caves in Europe. Dereva Skala has been excavated in the past. So there was a number of excavations there in the early 20th century. Then there was another one in 1950. So we already know something about what cultural and geological layers there are. Fortunately for us, about half of the cave is still unexcavated. But in the past, there's been various sort of important artifacts found there. So points made from bones, so bone points, really old sort of bone points, about 40,000 years old. Then also some leaf points, which is these sort of specific kinds of stone tools. Also, there's been a human tooth found in one of the cultural layers. So I'm again talking about that time period that I was talking about when I was talking about Hradem cave. So it's the Middle Upper Paleolithic transition. So the time period between about 40 and 50,000 years ago. So that there are unexcavated layers from that time period in Jetavarskala, and from past sort of research, we know that there's sort of quite a bit of cultural material. So we think that it has even greater potential than Hradem cave. So yeah, we're really excited about excavating there.
In an email, Duncan actually mentioned that it was the most exciting in terms of archaeological potential for the same reasons, Duncan.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, whereas Hradem was that we always knew there was going to be very little in terms of cultural artifacts there. Here we know that there was large numbers of leaf points during that crucial period. There was bone points, there was Neanderthal remains, modern human remains. I mean, there's even Iron Age hoards that were discovered in this cave. Not that we condone treasure hunting or anything like that, but it's basically it's a palimpsest of one cultural group after another. And when you, for all of the viewers of this who have visited this site, they'll know why. I mean, it's this incredible cathedral-like site that if I was staying in the area, I would want to camp there. So it's a really exciting place.
There's actually images on the screen at the moment of it, so you can kind of get the idea of the atrium feel of the cave.
It's also really exciting because it is right on the suggested pathway into Western Europe. So it was suggested people followed the Danube effectively. And so if we can find evidence for that period, then we can potentially look at that very question about where were people coming from? Does this Danubian idea work, or maybe it doesn't? Maybe they're coming from elsewhere. So yeah, it's the possibilities are endless, I guess.
And what interests me, maybe this is a question for you, Lad, about the kind of the project Human Origins in Central Europe. I guess in general, the first question is, I'm interested how these excavations and research is funded. And I also noticed that one of the projects was even had a crowdfunding that was associated with it. Could you tell us a little bit more about how these projects are funded and in general archaeological research?
So that's right. So yeah, talking about the crowdfunding. So our third field season in Hradem cave in 2016, that was funded through crowdfunding through the Indiegogo website. So in general, it's so the first sort of thing I should say is that for these kinds of projects, it's quite difficult to get proper funding, and sometimes it takes sort of several years. So the first time I started excavating Hradem cave in 2011, I managed to secure funding from so it was called Somopro, which is still running, I think. It was a new program. It stands for South Moravian Program for Distinguished Researchers. And so in 2010, I got a postdoctoral fellowship for 2 years. I was based at Masaryk University in Brno. And so through that funding, I got sort of money for research, to do the research in Hradem cave. So there's various sort of grant agencies. So some of the other sort of well-known ones are like the Leakey Foundation or National Geographic, where scientists can not just not just for archaeology and anthropology, but various other fields of science where you can sort of apply for funding. It's extremely competitive. But yeah, there's various other things that people can try. I mean, we tried crowdfunding once and that worked quite well. But yeah, usually the funding comes from sort of major sort of grant agencies that specialize in these projects, in funding these projects.
But Lad, I think it's fair to say that the crowdfunding is very different, and it's rather wonderful, because rather than these large organizations who you really don't know who is giving you the money, you know exactly who is giving you the money from. I mean, it's a very democratic way of funding archaeological research. And so I think that also meant that the outputs were very different. So I think I sent through a number of the video diaries we created for Hradem, and so these were some of the things that we sent to the people who had assisted us to make this a reality. And yeah, so we gave a number of public presentations, and it was a hell of a lot of fun, really. I think Lad would agree with that.
Yep.
So they were getting information like live from the excavation kind of thing, or before everyone else.
Yeah. So absolutely, before it was getting published, and they were the first to hear about these big discoveries.
That's amazing. And Lad, you mentioned that when you said something about when you're on your third season at Hradem Cave, how long do each of those seasons last, and how many times over the years have you been there? I take it it's a very long-term thing. It's definitely very distant from the idea I had of Time Team, where you turn up to a place for a week and you try and discover as much as you can.
Yeah, so the total time that I spent excavating in Hradem Cave was, so that was 3 field seasons in 2011, 2012 and 2016. So when I add up all that time, it was 5.5 months. And so in that 5.5 months, we excavated a 3 meter by 1 meter trench, all the way down to the bottom of the cave floor, which was, I think it was about 3.5 meters deep. So yeah, if you can imagine a 3 meter, 3 by 1 meter trench, 3 meters deep, and that took 5.5 months. So it's slow, painstaking work, but if it's done properly, and if it's planned properly, and then carried out properly, you can get some really great results. And we got that in. We've got a lot of data, and we were able to write sort of several, scientific articles about our results. Yeah.
And Duncan, I guess I've already asked Nick the question before, but it would interest me what you think about the different techniques that are used, or if there's different techniques used excavations or in archaeology in different regions of the world, whether it looks different on the Torres Strait than Europe, from more than just obviously different trees and different surroundings, but from the archaeological perspective.
Yeah, well, I would say definitely, and it's actually been rather wonderful because I've learned lessons from my time in Czech Republic, which I've brought back to Australia. So I think a very good example of that is there's a huge literature about portable art in Czech Republic, in Central Europe, and there's incredibly detailed ways of looking at these objects, but next to nothing has been written about that in Australia. And so we were able to bring back this the knowledge of what was going on in Europe to an Australian context, and that ended up there was a symposium on that, and now we have a book that is basically written about portable art in the Australia, Pacific and Asia. And so that was absolutely fantastic. And I guess vice versa, there are elements of Australian archaeology that are very, very different from what I have seen in Czech Republic. So as Nick was alluding to, and Lad, a long time is taken excavating these sites. And I think part of the reason behind that is the excavations we do in Australia tend to be a lot smaller. We have Aboriginal communities that hold us accountable. And so we basically need to get the most out of it. And so we excavate very, very carefully, sometimes in tiny 2-centimetre spits going down. We're able to get very, very detailed chronologies this way. We throw many, many different analyses at it. And so as a result, as Lad was saying, we get these incredibly complex records, and that includes environmental records, so looking at changes in environment and climate through time based on sediment analysis and pollen and all of these kind of things. And again, I think that's probably because we don't have the same features that people are finding in Czech Republic. So we rely on things like sediment a lot more. There may be hearths and these kind of things, but we're not going to get stone features or anything like that. So we just, we throw everything at it. And I suppose the other thing is that you just look at the archaeological record differently. So I guess I've been trained, for want of a better word, by Aboriginal communities that a stone artefact is not just a stone artefact, and the same goes for human remains or whatever it might be. These are deeply they embed a whole story behind them, and and so there's we need to be really careful about how we work with that, and we definitely look at these as not just a lump of rock that is tens of thousands of years old. We think about the person who was actually creating that stone artifact and how it might be sort of symbolically important to them. So I guess those and Lad also talked about the spoil heap, and I think this probably shows the ridiculous side in a way of Australian archaeology. And I had an idea that instead of just focusing on the intact deposit, it would be very interesting to see if there was any intact deposit within these spoil heaps, because obviously it's going to be very, very disturbed. People are just throwing bucket loads and wheelbarrow loads onto this spoil heap. But in theory, we could also get clumps of sediment and sediment adhering to artifacts that may all come from the same wheelbarrow. And sure enough, when we threw all of these analyses at this particular, at the sediment, at the artifacts, all of this, we looked at modern artifacts as well, and we found that there were these clumps of soil. And so that has actually changed how people think about these spoil heaps. We can't just dig them all out in one go and try and cherry pick the human remains and stuff like that and the artifacts. There's much, much more that we can get out of it.
So learning from that, is that something that, is that really a delicate and slow approach that you were describing, something that could prevent the need to return to these waste heaps? Or do you see it as useful in any way?
Well, I think I see the main use of this is, yes, maybe they don't need to dig the entire waste heap out, because what we're seeing here, unfortunately, and it's totally understandable, but these waste heaps are just disappearing as people try and get the important finds. But it's going to be very similar to what's happened with the Paleolithic cave sites themselves that have been totally excavated. And so now we will never find evidence for what was going on, what was captured within this cave as the techniques improve and all of that. So in a way, it's really important that people maybe think carefully about digging huge excavations and maybe just leave some of these sites for the future archaeologists.
That's fascinating. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Lad? Or?
No, I think I completely agree. Yeah, I think the only thing Duncan said it in different words, but all these archaeological sites, they're a non-renewable resource. So once the sediment is once the site is excavated and the sediment is removed, it's basically everything's gone. It's just, well, in a negative sort of way, it's destroyed. So that's why it's really, really, really important to sort of have a really good research design when approaching these sites, and just try and extract as much information out of it as possible, because once it's all excavated, it's gone forever. So that site is gone forever. So yeah.
Do you feel a lot of pressure because of that as an archaeologist? Or?
Yeah, you have to. It's really important to sort of do a good job, because there isn't. I mean, if you're only excavating a small portion of the site, then it's just that small portion of the site that's going to be gone forever. So you might still be able to excavate sort of next to it the following year or something. But yeah, it's and with archaeological finds, context is everything. So for example, if you sort of you can find stone artifacts or other types of artifacts that are very old, you can sometimes find them on the surface. So for example, in Europe, it's very common to, like, if you walk through a plowed field, you can, if there's a site underneath that field, the ploughing sort of brings up artifacts, so you can actually find them on the surface. But when you find things on the surface, usually it's out of its original context. So it's got sort of limited information potential, if you know what I mean. When you find it in the context, you sort of, when it's in its original context, when it was deposited, you can sort of glean all sorts of information from sort of that context that it's in. But once it's out of that context, you just have the object itself, but you don't know where it's from, so you can't get any of that other information.
I guess
does that make sense?
The importance of the context shows when we were talking before about even if the object's not there in the excavation, but like little bits of microsoil that is attached to it can tell you so much about the object, even though it's not even present. Kind of shows you,
That's right.
For me, that kind of shows how important that context is that you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're coming towards the end. Duncan, did you have anything you wanted to add at the end? Maybe what you're looking forward to in the next few months in your work?
Well, I think the thing I'm really looking forward to in Slovakia, as well as what we've already talked about, is the collaboration. So I really look forward to working with colleagues there. In terms of what's going on here, we've got excavations scheduled on Dawa Island in Eastern Torres Strait, which should be very exciting. This is one of the key initiation places, and so we know that there is deposits going down almost 2 meters in depth. So we're thinking that this is quite an old site. So yeah, I guess watch this space.
And which space is that? We'll obviously put a link to it.
Well, maybe in terms of the Central European thing, hopefully we'll have a few public lectures, and who knows, there may be more crowdfunding enterprises and YouTube videos. And in terms of the Czech Republic stuff, I guess it's going to be publications and public lectures. But yeah.
Awesome. And Lad, what have you got to look forward to over the coming months?
So at the moment I'm doing consulting work. So I'm excavating sort of Australian Indigenous sites, and it looks like that's going to be happening, at least for the next month or so. And yeah, like Duncan was saying, for next year, I'm really looking forward to the excavation in Zarawa. Hopefully, COVID is over by then, or at least partly over, so we can travel and start this exciting research.
And maybe should we try and persuade Jeremy here and the Slovakian or Czech embassy to host a public lecture?
I'm sure everyone would be absolutely thrilled. I think that's a wonderful idea.
Yeah.
Hopefully, technically, it'll work better than the stream. Yeah, so thank you everyone for taking part in today. Obviously, thanks to Nick as well, who had to run off. But I hope everything works out with the dig in Slovakia, and you may see more information about what's going on with our guests today in the future. Do end up deciding to do some kind of public lecture series on what's going on, I think it'll be fascinating, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed the discussion today. So thanks once again, everyone, and good night.
Yep. Thanks, Jeremy. I enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, see you, mate.